Buonasera, benvenuti a tutti a questo nuovo appuntamento della nostra rassegna Host in Translation. Naturalmente un speciale benvenuto ai nostri ospiti Richard Baldwin e Alessandro Merli. Anzitutto ve li presento. Mi sento di dire che Richard Baldwin è un autore del mulino, infatti ha già pubblicato 2 libri con noi. La grande convergenza, tecnologia informatica, web e globalizzazione, che è uscito nel 2018, e Rivoluzione globotica, globalizzazione, robotica e futuro del lavoro, che è uscito nel 2020. Richard Baldwin è un professore di International Economics alla Graduate School di Ginevra ed è editor in chief di Vox dal 2007. È stato presidente del CEPR dal 2012 al 2018, ha insegnato alla Columbia University e all'MIT ed è stato consulente di numerosi governi e istituzioni internazionali, non ultima la consulenza alla Casa Bianca tra il 90 e il 91. Oggi abbiamo l'opportunità di ascoltare da Richard come si aspetta che cambi il lavoro a livello globale e l'impatto che avrà sui singoli, in un processo che era già in corso e che è stato notevolmente accelerato dalla pandemia. È chiaro che le imprese sono state messe sotto pressione, il lavoro in presenza è stato fortemente scoraggiato, è cresciuto il telelavoro ed è diventato più che mai conveniente, quando possibile, affidarsi ai robot per contenere il costo del lavoro. Ecco, questo rientra nel processo che Richard Baldwin ha definito Globotics, coniando un termine che riunisce 2 fenomeni, la globalizzazione e la robotica, fenomeni che stanno rivoluzionando l'essenza stessa del lavoro. Questo è quello di cui immagino ci parlerà oggi Richard. Voglio anche ringraziarlo perché è stato così cortese da preparare per noi una serie di slide in italiano per aiutarci a seguire il suo intervento, quindi lo ringrazio a nome di tutti. La conversazione sappiamo che sarà in lingua inglese, sarà condotta da Alessandro Merli, fellow della Scuola di Studi Internazionali della Johns Hopkins University di Bologna e docente alla Bologna Business School. In precedenza ha lavorato per il Sole 24 Ore, tra l'altro con l'incarico di corrispondente da Londra e a Francoforte. Beh, il mio compito era di presentarvi e direi che l'ho esaurito. Passerò la parola a Alessandro, ma non prima di avervi ricordato che il 21 aprile, in questa stessa rassegna, è previsto l'incontro con Bina Garwal, l'economista indiana che studia le diseguaglianze di genere. Voglio richiamare la vostra attenzione sul fatto che per ragioni di fuso orario l'incontro sarà anticipato alle 15 anziché alle 18 e sarà condotto come sempre da Alessandro Merli, quindi l'appuntamento è a mercoledì prossimo. Ora Alessandro passo a te la parola, grazie a tutti dell'attenzione e a presto dunque.
Grazie Monica, grazie al Mulino per avermi invitato. We'll now switch to English for our conversation with Richard Baldwin. I won't have much to say other than by a fortunate coincidence this week The Economist magazine has on its cover the future of work and a survey on that. So what we're discussing here is no doubt very topical, and Richard has been looking at the interaction and the intersection between trade and technology for quite a long time. Monica has already mentioned the Great Convergence, his other book, which was actually published in the original version in 2016. So he was in a way prescient on this. I would like now to give the floor to Richard, and then we'll have a conversation after that. Of course, people in the audience are welcomed, invited and welcome to ask questions, which I think you can do through their respective platform which you've used to enter this conversation. So you can write your comments and I will read them back to comments or questions, and I'll read them back to Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alessandro, for those kind words of introduction. And also thank you very much, Monica, for the kind words about my past and my career. And I appreciate El Mulino publishing my books. It's been a great experience in Italian. Now, I have, as Monica mentioned, translated the slides into Italian with the help of my mother-in-law, who is actually born in Italy. But I'm going to speak in English because you die of laughing if I tried to pronounce all these words in Italian. So let's just get going with it. The title of the book, if you've heard, so I won't repeat that. Let me start to share my screen. Share screen, application window. There we go. Okay, and I'll make it big screen so you can see it better. There we go. Okay, shout out if this isn't working, but I think it is. So let me just start with a bit of a summary of what I think I would really like you to take away from this talk. A little bit about what's different about what I'm saying about globalization and automation than what other people are. So it can be seen in this kind of infographic. So you start with that big gray arrow, which is digital technology. And now all of us know digital technology is advancing at an incredibly fast pace. And what it's doing is leading to automation and globalization, both at the same time. Now, the usual discourse, people will talk either about the automation and jobs, or they will talk about globalization and jobs. And one of the main points I want to make, and the reason I invented this word globotics, is because I think it's important to realize that both are happening at the same time. Globalization and robotics happening at the same time. The second thing to notice about this is that these two blue arrows are affecting office and professional jobs, not just factory jobs and farm jobs and mining jobs. Over the last 25 years, globalization has been mostly about manufacturing in the rich countries and farming and mining in the broader world. This time, this type of globalization is affecting the white-collar workers, office workers, and professional workers. And then the last point here is that it's coming faster than most people believe and in ways that few expect. So these are the points I want to sort of bring out. But when you go back and say, what did I tell you tonight that you didn't know before, or hopefully, or why should you read the book? This is a sort of summary of what I want to get across. Now, I would like to put up this slide because the future is unknowable, but it's also inevitable, just to alert you that I'm talking about the future. And when I talk about the future, it means I actually don't know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm kind of making it up. Therefore, what I'd like you to listen to is the logic and the background facts I'm using to advance that logic, not so much the predictions themselves. Because all of us, all of our children, including all of us, our grandchildren, will be influenced by the way digital technology is changing the future of work. And you and your children will have to make up their minds as to how they deal with it. And what I hope this talk will do is help you think about it a little more carefully than was done before. So let's start with some definitions. Globotics, as I said before, it's globalization plus robots smashed together in an ugly word, but hopefully it's a word that you can remember. So here, when I talk about globalization, I'll be mostly talking about telemigration, or RI. RI stands for remote intelligence, to balance against artificial intelligence. So when I say telemigration, this is basically people working in offices in one country when they're sitting in another country. It's telework, teletravail from another country. And the robots in this particular case I'm talking about are not the physical, mechanical robots that you see so much in the news and in your news feeds. I'm talking about software robots that use AI to automate service sector jobs. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. So telemigration, as I said, is people sitting in one country working in offices in another country. And this can go in many, many different ways, and it's growing incredibly fast. And all of you will be fully aware that COVID has accelerated this enormously. Up till now, most of the telework, which has become very widespread in office and white-collar professional jobs, it's become very widespread in the rich countries. But so far, most of that's been done at home. But I'm predicting that as COVID comes back, as people start to hire back, there'll be a much greater substitution of domestic workers for online foreign workers who are much cheaper. Well, we'll talk about how that's going to happen. When I talk about these software robots or white-collar robots, there's really two different types of them. There's a sort of simple one, and the main software that does that is called robotic process automation. It's actually many different types of software in many different companies. But the idea is it takes over repetitive information shuffling jobs that humans do now, but you can teach a computer to do it very easily. And then there's a much higher level of robot, these kind of AI platforms, things like Siri and the software robots that translate things in Outlook or decide what's clutter and what's junk in your Outlook. Those are software robots. They're doing things that humans used to do, but more sophisticated. And they've penetrated into many of the professions, including law, medicine, journalism, architecture, engineering, and increasingly they're doing things that that humans could do. Now, COVID really changed these things, or more particularly, it accelerated things. So 4 points I'd like to make. There's a number of points, but first of all, lots of people have already been fired or furloughed or let go, or their company's gone bankrupt. And what that means is there is a lot of starting over to be done. So when the companies come back, when the activity comes back, companies will have to decide who and how they're going to hire people. And so it's much easier to think about going for a software robot or going for an offshore worker once the workers you had before are already fired. So that's going to make a change. Not so much in a country like Italy, at least not in the formal market, but in Anglo-Saxon countries and in the informal short-term contract markets in Italy, that will be a much easier choice for the firms to do rather than fire people who are actually there, which is what the case was before COVID. The second is that COVID led to an emergency digitalization. In other words, an emergency move to be online. And the interesting thing was not so much that it advanced the technological frontier, but it forced all of us to get to the technology frontier because everybody had to do it. You had to learn how to use Zoom, you had to learn to use cloud software, Dropbox, all those things, collaborative software. We had to use it if we wanted to continue working, which we did. And because everybody was doing it, you could excuse lots of mistakes and lots of problems. So the normal things that kept corporations from doing it was how do you coordinate it? How do you make sure it's fully, high quality and everything? But in COVID, there was all sorts of things excused. Mistakes were excused because COVID, Then the third is social distancing will raise the cost of having workers in the office, at least in the transition. I don't think we're going back to exactly the same way we were before. And in that transition, the fact that you have social distancing makes online workers and software robots more attractive than they were before because they don't take up any space. So many companies, for instance, have gone to A team and a B team because they didn't want to double the amount of office space, and they go back and forth. And in that kind of setting, replacing a few workers with robots, software robots or online workers makes more sense than it did before. And lastly, lots and lots of firms are under extreme cost pressure, which gives them either an excuse or an incentive to cut costs by going for the software robots or offshore workers. Okay, so if you've been listening to me up till now, you sort of realize that maybe there's nothing new here except the COVID stuff. And what I want to do in the next few slides is argue that right now, starting say 2016, 2018, things are really different. Now, the first thing is to say that today AI is different. So in 2019, or today anyways, I wrote the slide a long time ago, it's 2021 now, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual outputs, recognize subtle patterns, And back in 2015, when I was writing my last book, they couldn't. So what changed? Now, my answer is that the programming changed. So when psychologists talk about human thinking, like this guy who got the Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman, he got a Nobel Prize in economics, he talked about thinking fast and thinking slow. So thinking fast is conscious thinking, effortful thinking. It's like when you're trying to do arithmetic on a piece of paper or in your head. You know you're doing it, and it's hard to do it, and usually you can only do one thing at a time. Now, as it turns out, since you know you're doing it and you know how you're doing it, even in the old days, you could teach a computer to do it by writing programming code. In other words, code is a sequence of logical steps telling the computer what to do in every situation. Now, in order to give a computer that cognitive capacity, we had to know how we did that thinking. And this was thinking slow. Thinking slow is like that. It's conscious and effortful. Now, thinking fast is a very different type of human thinking. It's unconscious. It's effortless. It's instantaneous. It's like what happens when you're walking down the stair and you lose your balance and you do all the calculations your brain does instantly to move all the muscles to catch yourself so you don't fall down the stairs. Now, you have no idea how your body calculated all those things, taking in the senses, telling the muscles to do everything, and it did it just like that. Now, since we don't know how we how we do that calculation or that thinking, we could never really teach a robot to do it or a computer to do it. But with machine learning, where you just get a whole bunch of data and you estimate a model of this process, we can now give computers many thinking fast processes. And that's why computers have gotten so good at translating language or natural language recognition or image recognition. These are thinking fast tasks. Now, my main point here is that computers now have a set of cognitive skills that they did not have just a couple years ago. And many of those skills are useful in the office jobs, professional jobs. And as a consequence, lots of service jobs that could not be automated before now can be. So the second thing is that automation and globalization are happening together. And I won't go through this. I talk a lot in the book of how the movement from farms to factories with mechanization, what the globalization came 100 years after the mechanization. And then when we went from factories to offices, starting from the 1970s, automation started about 20 years before the automation really got going. This time, it's coming at the same time, much faster. So the next one, so I've got the English here. It's a little bit hard for me to read the Italian, but so it's coming faster than most believe, and it's a funny thing about coming faster because there's absolutely nothing new about digital technology. It's been going on. Moore's law, for example, the capacity of processors is doubled every 2 years since Richard Nixon was president. There's nothing surprising about it, but people keep getting disrupted again and again. And I want to present a little framework that helps explain why it is that people can keep getting surprised about this sort of stuff. So here's my way of thinking about it. If we put progress on the vertical axis and years on the horizontal axis, I'm going to assert that the straight line is how people think instinctively about progress. And here I'm thinking about thinking fast. You don't take out your calculator, you just wonder, like, is it likely that half the buses in Milan will be driven by robot drivers in 3 years? You can't really do calculations. You kind of think back a little bit what has happened in recent years, you read about, and then you project forward that the changes in the future will be a little bit like the changes in the past. So that's kind of straight lining the future. But that's not how digital technology works. Digital technology starts out very slow, and although it's doubling every couple of years, the base is so low that it doesn't look like it's doing much. And by the way, if you think this looks like COVID curve, it's the same thing. So it looks like nothing, 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 and all of a sudden it takes off. And where those two things meet is what I call the holy cow moment. In other words, people are disrupted. They knew that technology was coming. They just thought that it was going to go linearly, when in fact it was going exponentially. Okay, I'm going to try and get through this because I want lots of time for the discussion, which is always more lively. But what I want to make a point is that this one is not going to arrive like globalization and automation did in the past. So the first thing is, it's not going to be like all of a sudden an entire building full of insurance employees shuts down in downtown Rome and everybody's fired. That's the way it happened with factories. A factory would shut down and everybody was fired. It was very visible. It was very painful, very concentrated. But that's not how it's going to happen. I think it's going to be more like downgrade unemployment. And it's happened in a number of fields, especially journalism is a good example, where journalists used to have good jobs with permanent contracts doing regular things in offices. Many of them have now been laid off and they're still doing journalism, but their jobs have been downgraded in terms of security because they're doing gig work more or less. Sometimes they make more, sometimes they make less. But in any case, they've had a downgrade of employment. So they're not going into open employment. They're going into jobs which are either more precarious or lower paid, continuing more or less to do the same thing. And this is how I'd really like you to think how it will actually arrive into your offices. So this is what I call the iPhone infiltration. And the insight here is, if you go back 8 or 9 years ago, these things we have, these weren't much use, and they didn't really dominate our society. But year after year, change by change, they started taking over our communication life. They changed our work life because we're always online. We started reading our emails there. We started buying our tickets, one thing after another, and eventually they really have infiltrated our lives and changed the way our societies work, changed the way our families work, changed the way our work works, changed the way we interact with our cities. They've been incredibly influential. But here's the thing. 10 years ago, nobody decided to let that happen. It just happened. It was billions of seemingly small, seemingly uncoordinated changes which eventually transformed our societies. And I think Globots are going to come into our workplace in the same way. It won't be all of a sudden the entire marketing department or the entire HR department is fired. It will be one task taken over by a software robot, let's say looking through CVs that have been submitted for a job. And other tasks offshore, say having a call center in the Philippines, do a pre-interview with people. One task at a time, the jobs, the way we work will be changed by Globots. But after 5-6 years, we'll go, how did we get along without them? So now let's talk about the future of globalization and my telemigration in particular. That's the one I'm going to focus on because that's the one that COVID has changed so much. So this is my assertion. The wage gaps will make it profitable. The international wage gaps will make it profitable. Digital technology will make it possible. Now, I want to focus very quickly on some channels. I'll just read these out because I want to get through this. First of all, domestic telecommuting is booming, and that's fairly easy to turn into international telecommuting, because after all, if you can work at home from the country, you could also work from home from another country. The online digital platforms are allowing firms to find small workers. Advanced telecoms is making remote workers less remote, and things like automatic translation is tearing down language barriers very, very quickly. So my prediction is that there will be a tsunami of global talent. So in some sense, if you go back the last 25, 30 years, the globalization and automation was about a flow of talent and automation coming to industry. Unskilled workers from all around the world started making stuff, competing with workers sitting in Italy or wherever. The 2020s, I believe, the same thing will happen in services. The talented, low-cost foreigners sitting abroad will be offering services in our offices, and that will be a tsunami which will change things. And that's what puts the second word in my English title, which is upheaval. I think that will cause a great deal of distress in the rich countries, great deal of opportunity in the developing countries. Okay, so let me just finish up here quickly. The future of work. What is the future of work? Well, the thing is, you should be confident that new jobs will arrive. Why? I don't know what they are. Alessandro doesn't know who they are. Nobody knows what they are. Only the entrepreneurs who will invent them as they go forward will know that. But you shouldn't be worried. In 1850, when people were leaving the farms and going to the factories, they had no idea what the jobs of the future would be because there was no car industry. There was no pharmaceutical industry. There was no electric goods industries. But we had an idea of what the jobs that were going to would be like because they would be an industry. So the fact that we can't know the names of the jobs we're doing doesn't mean we can't guess or shouldn't guess what they might be like. I suggest we use a process of elimination. And here's what I'd like, the kind of quips I'd like you to hold on to. Globots will do what they can. We will do what Globots can't. And the reason is because Globots will be so much cheaper than domestic labor. Software robots on the margin are basically zero cost. You have to set them up and stuff, but once they're there, they can be replicated very easily. And foreign online workers are very often a 10th or 15% or 15th of work costs in the G7 countries. So if it can be done by a Globot, it probably will be. And what that means, the jobs that remain, and they will remain, will be doing things that Globots can't do. So the question about the future of work is, what can't Globots do? Not what they can do. So what can't AI do? So as it turns out, there's lots of studies of this by McKinsey and all the Oxford Institute, and lots of people have studied this. With the current AI, the things that AI can't do very well is the most human things. And in my book, I have a whole chapter about why it is AI has trouble doing the most human things. Things like curiosity, empathy, managing and motivating large groups of people, dealing with unknown situations, applying ethics, things like that AI has a difficulty with, which I talk about. But the fact is, it's not very good at the most human tasks in our jobs. Then the question is, what can't remote intelligence? In other words, what can't telemigrants do? And the only thing they can't do, since they really are human and they really are talented, is be in the same room, either with other people or with machines. Now, if you put those two things together, it's clear that the long-run future of work is going to involve jobs that are more human, since that's the stuff that AI can't do, and more local, since that's what telemigrants can't do. Now, hopefully, this increase in productivity, and it will be an increase in productivity, will make the society richer, and my hope is it will make it more generous. So it will be a good future of work. Our job, the machines and the telemigrants will be taking the robotic, dull things out of our jobs. What's left over is the most human, most local thing. So I think communities will be more local. I think the jobs will be more human. People will be happier. But we have to manage the transition, because I think the digital transformation is eliminating jobs at a much faster pace than human ingenuity and entrepreneurship is creating jobs. But in the after we get past the short term or medium term, there'll be all the jobs we need and we'll be better off. So I think the point is governments have to try and manage the transition, not try and stop it. So I'll stop right there, and thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions and the discussion with Alessandro. I'll stop sharing now. But this is a nice thing that Larry Summers said about my book. Best book yet on the new economic era. Like, Larry's a good friend of mine. Okay. Let's see. Am I back? Yes. Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Richard, very much. I have to congratulate you for your slides in Italian, or rather, I should congratulate your mother-in-law. She certainly did an excellent job. You know, this thing with languages is tricky sometimes. You know, I remember a few years back, the former German finance minister Wolfgang Schäuble said to an international audience, "If I speak German, some of you will not understand me. If I speak English, none of you will understand me." So I think it's right that we should stick, each of us, to try and speak our own language. And there's room for all sort of problems, even in this area of teleworking or remote working. In Italy, for some reason, we use an English expression, which is smart working. We're not even sure if this is really smart working or not so smart. But anyway, the other thing
let me just point out that I use Google Translate to translate the slides, and my mother-in-law only made a few changes. So if you have slides in English, you highlight it, you right-click, you can translate it into English in PowerPoint right now.
So Google Translate works. The other thing that I got from your presentation is that I got out of journalism just in time, before being swept away from this tide of globotics and all that. But more seriously, starting from the end of your presentation, you said we don't know what the new jobs will come from. But of course, that's exactly what everybody wants to know, right? Where will the jobs for the workers who are displaced by the Globotics upheaval come from? In a way, when the other wave of globalization or the mixture of globalization technology came and affected factory workers, there were a lot of talks of retraining them, and more or less we had an idea. People talked about moving up the value-added chain and all these sort of things. Where will the jobs come from for all these people who are displaced by globotics?
Well, again, as I said, we can't know the names, but let's think a little bit more about them. First of all, I think the transition will be easier than it was between farms and factories back in the 19th century and factories to offices in the 20th century, because basically people will be going from one type of service job to another type of service job. They're going from service jobs now that are sheltered by technology to jobs that are sheltered from artificial intelligence and remote intelligence by their very nature. So that's the first thing, is it's easier. And the second thing is these service jobs, both before and after, will be mostly in cities, which is where most people work. So it won't involve quite the disruption of the other one. But basically, what I think we see the tendency already in quite a number of professions, and I think the word I like is downgrade unemployment. So just to give you an example, I was giving this talk last year, or actually in 2019, the last time we could travel, in London, and a guy who runs a big law firm in London came up to me afterward and said that they had offshored about 20% of the preliminary legal work to low-wage, high-skilled countries like Kenya and South Africa, which had British legal systems, but the lawyers cost 1/10 as much. And so a lot of the newly trained lawyers in London are having a lot of problems. This led to a drop, or at least an increase of their salary. But they're not unemployed because they're smart people with skills. They know how to talk, they know how to write, they know how to read, they know how to analyze. So they're looking around and doing different things. They're not being lawyers like they hoped they would. So it's a downgrade unemployment. Their jobs are typically more precarious than they would have been if they'd got a job in a big law firm. So that's sort of an example that I can't tell you which jobs, but those skills that people got in the service sector are very portable. It's just you're going to have to focus on the ones that are more human and on jobs where local knowledge or cultural affinities are more important. So that's.
Now, there is a role, I guess, for governments to play in this transition. Is there something that governments can do? The Trump administration in the US, for some reason, seemed to be fighting yesterday's war, right? They were trying to protect steel jobs, coal jobs. This is the war of 2 generations ago. These jobs were gone a long time before Trump came into power. He was not going to bring them back, no matter how he tried. Of course, he did it for electoral purposes, but still, he seemed to be fighting yesterday's war. I wonder, in this transition that is coming, is still to come, is there something that, for instance, someone like Biden or the Biden administration will do or can do?
Sure. So that just to beat on Trump, it's just so nice to have the headspace. Every day you don't have to deal with some stupid Trump tweet, and now we can think about other stuff. It was just so engrossing. It's amazing how fast it changed. But let me just leave that aside. So the thing about Trump was, in the United States, less than 10% of the workforce work in manufacturing, everything, to say nothing about steel or coal. It's a tiny number of people, whereas 80 or 90% of the people work in the service sector. So although the jobs it's going to be affecting a much wider range of people. And you're absolutely right. Tariffs and shutting down globalization doesn't work because you could still automate. This is software after all. You're not going to forbid people from using software. And the telemigration is basically impossible to stop if you don't shut down the internet. So it's not through protection. I think what it is that governments will have to do more of helping people change jobs. And that is, in the end, what we're talking about. They're talking about going from service jobs to sheltered service jobs. And as I pointed out, that's not as bad as it was before, but people will need help. People will need help with retraining. Maybe they need some more digital skills. Maybe they need some more soft skills. And so I think this kind of active labor market policy that people have done, income support, if they have to change houses or change locations, that kind of help. So my model is what they do in Denmark, for example, where the government stands ready to make sure that every worker who loses his job will find another job. And they will do whatever they need to make that happen, retraining, apprenticeships, whatever. And that will then smooth the transition and reduce the impact. So if I can take it down one more level and sort of what should we do about education? I mean, I think one of the messages that I stress is hard skills are the easiest things to either automate or offshore. And there are a lot of clever people in the subcontinent and in Ukraine and people like places like that who have very good hard skills, who think $5 an hour is a middle class living, or $3 an hour is a middle class living. So teaching kids hard skills, which was the old idea, STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, math, that is there's nothing wrong with that. There's going to be lots of good jobs there, but that's not the panacea now, because lots of people in the world have those skills, and they're actually the ones that are relatively easy to provide at distance. So it's softer skills, it's human skills, it's creativity that's going to have to go. Now, you mentioned Biden. So Biden, I think, actually has this right. The guy's got a lot right, actually. So he is talking about a two-track economy. He's talking about making American workers in industry and high-tech industries more competitive, with R&D and whatever promotion of industries, but making sure that lots of people have jobs in these protected industries like care industries. It was one of the big examples. So we all have a lot more need for healthcare, and caring jobs could be made better, and a lot of people could be employed. So the idea there is that there will be sheltered jobs. Healthcare jobs are classic future jobs I'm talking about, because they both require human elements, and you actually have to be there, or at least a lot of it. So this is another example can be seen in Japan, where Japan has a very two-track economy. They're incredibly competitive when it comes to industry and a few high-tech services, but they're incredibly uncompetitive in the whole retail sector, the healthcare sector. And in Japan, they call it the high-touch economy. So most people work in uncompetitive jobs, and not particularly highly paid. That's where most people work. And then a few people work in these, Toshibas and Samsungs and SoftBank, where they're very high-tech and very, very productive. So I think it's going to look more like that. And we just have to help people make the transition. So I'm not sure I actually answered the question, but there's lots of stuff that the government can do, basically help people switch jobs and retrain when they need to. And if the worst comes to worst, if we really do start getting social revolution. Government may have to try and slow it down, but would be very damaging in many other ways.
Well, in your presentation, you talked quite a bit about the technology part of it, but of course, and this is, you've been talking about it for years, I would say, there's the globalization part of it, which is as important, and these things are happening, as you said, at the same time. And the global part of globotics seems to be the one that is more under threat, both from the populist backlash and from actually the fragility of globalization itself. Recently, that was brought to evidence or to light from the incident in the Suez Canal, which blocked the supply chains all over the world. There's also one question online from one of our person in our audience, Ivan Bazzi, who says, well, how shortages of material come into this picture, especially integrated circuits, and we've seen that the shortage of chips actually is making it more fragile, the whole global supply chains. So how to fight this threat to globalization? On one side, the political threat, let's call it this way, the populist backlash. On the other hand, the threat from the fragility of globalization itself, of the supply chains, be it accidents like Suez, bottlenecks, or the chip shortage.
Sure. So let me just make clear that when I'm talking about the future of work, I'm talking about service jobs, in which case that boat getting stuck in the Suez Canal was irrelevant. Now, chips might do a little bit, but so there's very little to do about, there's basically impossible to stop globalization of services online stuff. I mean, think about how hard it would be for the Swiss government to prevent me from coming on this to talk to you in Italy. I'm exporting a service. It would be very hard for them to stop that unless they stop the whole thing. Now, what we're talking about, the question is about goods, globalization of goods. And again, I would just point out that less than 10% of the Italian population works in the goods industry. So it may affect us as consumers, but it's not a work thing. Okay, that said, I have written huge amounts about global value chains and what to say about it. And I have something to say about this. That is, I think what the pandemic has done is showed us that there's been some over-reliance on single points of failure, either too much of intermediate stuff going to one country, China in particular, or one company being too important in certain supply chains. Now, when you think about that, there's nothing new about that if we were talking about food. So there is no government in the world who just lets the market decide for food, because we've been through so many examples where a shock to food security makes people starve to death. And so every government in the world has expensive, intrusive policies for food security. Now, what we forgot is we probably should have similar things in medical supplies. So I think that all these policies will be extended to medical supplies, and we will get expensive and intrusive, policies that lead to a diversification of supply of medical supplies. But beyond that, and maybe semiconductors and a few other things, we'll see semiconductor plants take years to produce. So once this current thing goes away, we'll see whether the government still want to spend the billions making the plants. But in any case, it's just a few things: medical supplies, chips, who knows, a few other things, but not cars, not electronics, not pharmaceuticals, not chemicals, not the clothing, not shoes. A lot of this talk about what the reshoring is and the fragility is really all about medical supplies. And that's somewhere between 7 and 10% of world trade is in medical supplies. And so there, I think we will get some readjustment, some probably not reshoring. You don't want to bring everything at home because we have disasters at home too. But say coalitions of countries who are willing to not block exports in times of need, and some thinking more clearly about where you're actually getting your stuff and making sure you don't have a single point of failure. So I do think there will be policy. Lots of governments are starting it all over the world, but I think it'll be limited to this relatively small industry of medical supplies.
You mentioned in passing China, and China is, of course, a big elephant in the room, if I may say so. And There are trade wars with China that are now also tech wars. I mean, we've seen the case of 5G, for instance. Let's talk a little bit about the competition and the confrontation between the US and China in this new age, and in this new world of globotics.
So let me make a couple things. So when I was in the White House, the Bush White House, and this was Bush the elder, not Bush the younger, US and Japan were fighting over exactly the same things. The bilateral deficit, unfair competition, stealing IP. They had a form of capitalism which was different than America. And most importantly, they were beating America out of the auto industry, the electronics industry, the semiconductor industry, and it made some people very upset. And we had this big pushback. Now, ultimately, it was very good for the world economy that Japan rose and we had some more competition in cars and electronics and everything to Americans and Germans and Italians or whatever. It was a good thing. But and they never really changed their system. So what it was we had to find an interface between these two different forms of capitalism, American capitalism and Japanese capitalism. They're very different. And I think that's the challenge we have now. China is not going to become like us, and we aren't going to become like China. Therefore, and China is now the largest manufacturer, soon will be the largest economy. It's not going away, and we wouldn't want it to go away. So what we have to do is find an interface of how these two forms of capitalism can play fair, or at least a set of rules that seem fair by their playing. And that's what I think we're working towards. I think that's what Obama was working towards. Trump disrupted a lot of things. He's accelerated the confrontation to a certain extent, but he was not working towards a modus vivendi, to use an Italian phrase. He was fighting. He thought he could win a trade war. He thought somehow they would back down. We obviously had no idea of the Chinese history. When white people come to China and talk about trade being forced on them, things in China go like Boxer Rebellion, all these sorts of things. So it was crazy and incompetent, but Obama had started doing it, and Biden, I think, is continuing it. Now, Biden is being very political. I mean, he in his mind, and I think most people agree, the big problems of America are at home. And China is one of the things that basically Democrats and Republicans, almost all across the board, agree that we should be tougher on China. So I think what Biden is doing is being tough on China in ways that hopefully aren't too disruptive and let's hope don't lead to war, because he wants to deal with infrastructure. He wants to deal with welfare, healthcare, more progressive taxation, getting corporations to pay their way. He doesn't want to deal with China now. So I think he's letting it go. But the task, what we need is to find a set of rules so we can all play together. And the WTO isn't that far from it. We need some changes in the way things are done, especially the treatment of state-owned enterprises and subsidies. But it's not that far away from what we need. If everybody sort of calms down, sets the rules, plays by the rule, and we get trust back, I think the rise of China can be useful for everybody, humanity and consumers and cooperative, just like the rise of Germany ultimately was good for Europe. When Germany's industrial power came back, it was good for Europe in the end, although it was very threatening in the beginning. When Japan rose, it was good ultimately for the world. I think the same will be true for China, but we have to find a way of living together.
People wonder if you've, of course, been based in Europe now for a long time, and you've been an observer of European things as well. People wonder if Europe can play a role in this, or will it just be squeezed by the two superpowers?
Yeah.
The pandemics may make you think that no, it can't, because it handled the whole thing so badly. But I was wondering what your on this intersection of technology and trade, what's Europe's role, if there is any?
So I think Europe has a big role to play. But let me just point out that if you look at the cumulative number of deaths, the UK is much worse than the US, and the US is much worse than the EU as a whole. So actually, Europe on the whole has done pretty well in this lockdown compared to the United States and certainly compared to the UK. It's just the vaccine which is a problem. And I think when we look back from 2023, 2024, these few months difference won't matter that much and certainly won't matter to the cumulative deaths. So I would reject that the European Union as a whole has done a terrible job, because the deaths are much lower than they are in the US, cumulative deaths, what I'm talking about. So the second thing, to get more on the technology thing, one of the advantages that the EU has is that it's willing to create regulations, and it's large enough for those regulations to actually influence the world. So it's called the Brussels effect, and it's very clear in the privacy regulations, GDPR, is what we call it, directive. And it has influenced the way privacy is done all over the world, because Europe set this and enforces it, where the US is not willing to set standards, and China plays by a completely different set of rules on privacy and things like that. So I think Europe, through regulations, let's say of 5G, of Internet of Things, of privacy, of digital life, of online work, all those sorts of things, I think by leadership and coordinating, setting standards, it will make a difference. The other is that basically the US needs Europe to settle this infrastructure, this interface thing. So the US on its own can't get China to agree to a set of interfaces which everybody can live with, but US together with Europe would, because that's the market that China is facing. I mean, China sells a lot to itself, but that's the market it's facing. So I think the US needs to cooperate with Europe in order to set the stage for these rules going forward. So there's two things there. One is the general dealing with technology, and there I think Europe's ability to regulate and stick to those regulations and interest in regulating is setting world standards, and therefore has a role in the world. And when it comes to settling the great problem of how do you interface Chinese capitalism with Western capitalism, I think Europe also has a big role to play side by side with the US.
We're fast running against the end of the time that was allotted to us, and I want to throw out a couple of issues that may need another complete talk or another hour, but which you'll have to answer very, very fast. And these are two things that people worry about. And one is the dominance of big tech. And people think that in an era of globotics, this may become even worse. Big tech dominating our lives and the ability of, for instance, government to do something to control them. And the other question is, with technology more and more pervasive, is the question of cybersecurity, which I've seen popping up in various incidents that have occurred. I wonder how you look at these two things, big tech dominance, cybersecurity.
So let me start with big tech dominance. In my book, there's a chapter on how I think the upheaval, the backlash against all this robotics and globotics would come. And in there, I predict that probably the focal point of the backlash will be big tech. Sometimes they call it the techlash. Because a backlash against big changes in the labor market don't end up as being just one thing. It starts as one thing, but it spills out, whether it's 1848, 1968, 1989. It all starts with something and then spills over. And I was talking about where triggers could come from, and big tech is one of it, because a lot of people don't like big tech for all sorts of reasons. The fact that they're manipulating our children's minds to get them to play longer. The fact that it was an individual company that shut Trump off Twitter. It was a private decision, not a public decision. I agree with that decision, but it shouldn't really be a private company. The fact that they keep buying each other up, those small ones, which in my mind is absolutely crazy, and the fact that they've dominated advertising and taken it away from journalists, I think that's a big problem. So I very much agree that big tech, although it does wonderful things, it is woefully underregulated. And now we're starting to see both Europe and even in the United States starting to take it on and regulate it. And you'll see in China, they're starting to regulate their own tech giants. So that the idea that we should worry about their market dominance is really something to be taken more. The trouble is that much of our competition policy law is based on what it does to consumer prices. And in a market where there are no consumer prices, everything's zero price, and the transactions between the consumer and the company is a barter, my deal, my data in exchange for your free service. There are no prices. I mean, there is a price, but it's an invisible one. And it's showing up in other places like advertisement or dominance, other places. We have to change the rules to do that. I think we would be better off breaking up quite a few of them. And I personally worry about it. I mean, I use them all the time, of course. Now, cybersecurity is not really my area, but it's clearly a very, very important thing. And it's something where we really need the government to get involved more in, because there's the kind of spillovers you see when hospitals get taken hostage, and goodness knows they can shut down power things. Who knows? There's lots of cyber problems. So I think it's something that requires more thought, but it's not me who's going to do that. It's like you need techie guys. But I agree that it's very much like I was just looking at, for instance, I've been doing a report on telemigration in Colombia, and the government's trying to promote that. And the consulting firm A.T. Kearney goes around and says, where's a good location to offshore jobs to? Like, where should the telemigrants grow? And they just added on digital residence to their criteria, which means cybersecurity, privacy laws, and things like that, because they're realizing that when you say offshore a bunch of insurance company jobs to Bogota, if that company in Bogota gets hacked because they have poor cybersecurity, then Colombia is not attractive. So the very idea that cybersecurity is now entering into commercial calculations, I think is bringing it up, but needs to come up much faster, because these guys, the cyber criminals and the cyber terrorists, are way ahead of us. So it is something I worry about, but I don't have many solutions because I just barely understand the stuff myself.
I noticed that the Edizioni del Mulino, which is your publisher, has just put up in the comments or in the chat section of our talk the short presentation, both written and a short video of your volume in Italian, Rivoluzione, globotica. That may also be a signal that we're at the end of our chat. So I would like to thank you. I would like also to note that you end the book in a fairly optimistic note about the future in the of work in the globotics era, and I noticed that the Economist magazine report that appeared this week also takes more or less the same tack. They undoubtedly must have read your book. So with that, I think I would like to thank you, Richard Baldwin, for being with us today, and thank Il Mulino for hosting us. And we'll see everybody next week with Bina Agarwal talking about gender inequality. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alessandro, for an excellent conversation. Very thought-provoking questions.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.